I was at a dinner party last week, sitting across from a woman who seemed to embody the very spirit of the 2026 Berkeley study. She was brilliant, a high earner in tech, and she spent 20 minutes passionately defending the need for radical structural egalitarianism in modern relationships. Her eyes were bright as she talked about dismantling old power structures. She sounded like a manifesto come to life. But then the conversation shifted to her dating life. She pulled out her phone to show us a profile she'd just dismissed. The man in the photo looked perfectly pleasant. A mid-level architect, slightly traditional, mentioning in his bio that he valued stability and clear family roles. Her expression changed instantly. The warmth vanished, replaced by a cold, almost clinical detachment. She didn't just say he wasn't her type, she called him sociologically obsolete. She looked at his photo and said, "He's still trying to trade on a contract that was voided years ago. Why would I invest my time in a depreciating asset?" That moment was chilling. It wasn't just a difference in preference, it was a total collapse of shared reality. On one hand, she was professing a deep commitment to equality. On the other, she was applying a ruthless, hyper-rational filter that viewed the median man as a statistical error. It made me realize that what we're calling a values gap isn't a misunderstanding or a lack of empathy. It's a binary fission of the human experience. We are living through the 2026 gender schism, a moment where men and women have stopped speaking the same language because they are no longer navigating the same economic or biological map. While we talk about communication, the data suggests something much more final. The shared values that once held our social fabric together have officially become a historical relic. To understand why, we have to look past the rhetoric and into the brutal sociology of what happens when the old social contract finally hits zero. That opening story is, as raw as it is, really just frames what we need to get into today. I mean, the structural implications are huge.
They are.
So our mission for this deep dive is to look at this values gap, not as, a simple communication problem. It's a systemic collapse. It's rational. We're going to look at the sociological decay that's happening because of these huge shifts in economics, behavior, and technology.
Right. We're really looking at the brutal math of a contract that's just hit zero.
Exactly.
And it's so important that we approach this clinically. We have to set aside the moral judgments and just look at the data. Look at how people are rationally adapting to a totally new environment. We've sort of organized our analysis around three big pillars that explain this whole disintegration.
Okay, so what are they?
First, we've got the hard numbers. The quantitative evidence showing the collapse of traditional mating patterns, which is all being driven by educational and economic parity. The old contract is just financially obsolete.
Right.
Second, we're going to apply some behavioral ecology, which sounds complicated, but it's really about John B. Calhoun's behavioral sink theory. It's a chillingly accurate way to explain the mass withdrawal and reproductive inhibition we're seeing, especially with the digital world amplifying everything.
And the third?
The third is looking at the result of all that, the emergence of what look like hyper-rational survival strategies, particularly for men, things like stoic indifference and this idea of monk mode.
Okay, let's unpack all of that. We should probably start with the foundation, which is economics. It seems so clear that these irreversible changes in the workforce and, in education are the real engine behind this schism.
They are. It's the engine that voids the entire contract. I mean, historically, for most of civilization, society was built on this very specific bioeconomic bargain.
The provider and the nurturer.
The provider for nurturer deal, exactly.
Yeah.
A man provided resources and protection. A woman provided nurturing and reproductive certainty. That framework basically dictated everything: property rights, social roles, family law. And it was stable, because both people had high instrumental value inside that structure.
That structure has been dismantled.
Completely dismantled by institutional success. I mean, it's the result of women achieving, independent access to resources, career mobility, and crucially, educational parity, which is, by all measures, a huge success story.
But it has consequences. And when you look at how this plays out for, say, a high-status independent woman today, that old contract, it doesn't just feel unfair. It feels like a bad business deal,
right?
A financial liability.
That is the absolute crux of it. I mean, look at that story of David and Elena in Seattle. David's a project manager, makes a good median income. Elena, on the other hand, is a senior software engineer, highly paid. She has her finances totally sorted out.
Owns her own house, 401k is maxed out, has her own insurance.
Everything. So when David proposed marriage, Elena rejected the legal contract. And her reasoning was it was pure logic. From a financial perspective, getting married offered her zero additional security.
But a ton of potential liability.
A ton of potential liability if they got divorced. She already had everything the traditional contract was designed to secure for a woman.
So she saw the marriage contract not as a social bond, but as a balance sheet. And the numbers just didn't add up for her.
Precisely. And that's a perfect real-world example of how the median man's traditional instrumental value, which has always been tied to his ability to provide, well, it gets deflated to zero when the woman in the relationship already has superior resources.
Which leads to what you called incentive incompatibility.
Exactly. If the old rewards for men, the traditional roles, they just vanish. I mean, why would you endure the massive effort and competition to be a provider if that very capacity is no longer valued or needed by the most desirable partners? The role itself becomes, either irrelevant or even pathologized.
It just creates this vacuum of meaning, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It's the main social reward. A stable family, a partnership is off the table because the requirement to provide has been nullified. Then the whole incentive structure just falls apart for a huge chunk of men.
And this isn't just a few stories here and there. We have massive demographic data that confirms this is a structural shift. There's an extensive European study that looked at educational assortative mating across 27 countries. It's a huge data set.
Okay, so just to make sure everyone's on the same page, let's quickly define the terms here. Hypergamy, which is the old pattern.
That's where the man has a higher level of education than the woman.
Right. And hypogamy is the reverse. The woman has the higher education level, and homogamy is when they're about the same.
Correct. And the core finding from that study is that the relationship market is going through a radical, irreversible restructuring. The rise in female educational advantage is empirically directly linked to the decline of hypergamy.
So how do they measure that?
Sociologists use something called the Female Educational Advantage Index, or F-index. A score of 0.5 means there's parity, men and women are equally educated. Well, if you look at the oldest cohort in the study, people born before 1954, the F-index was 0.45, a clear male advantage.
The historical norm.
The historical norm. Now, fast forward to the youngest group, they looked at people born in 1980 or after. The F-index jumped to 0.58.
Wow.
That's a uniform, significant female educational advantage right across the continent. Women are, simply put, out-educating men. It's a global trend, and it's hit a tipping point in Europe.
So if the available partner pool is flipped like that, what does that reversal actually do to relationship structures on the ground?
It causes the dramatic fall of what's called the hypergamy index, or H-index. This index measures the prevalence of hypergamous couples versus hypogamous couples. A positive number means hypergamy is dominant. A negative number means hypogamy is.
And what do the numbers show?
The pooled European sample saw the H-index just plummet. It went from a strong positive 0.41 in the oldest cohort down to a staggering negative 0.48 in the youngest one.
That's almost a full point reversal. It's a colossal sociological shift in less than a single lifetime.
It is absolutely overwhelming, and the implication is crystal clear. In 23 of the 27 nations they analyzed, hypogamous couples, where the woman is more educated, now outnumber hypergamous couples.
So homogamy, pairing with someone at your level, is still number one.
Yes, homogamy is still the most common, but the next most prominent type of union is now hypogamy. The sociological forecast is basically that traditional hypergamous relationships are going to become increasingly rare, just pushed to the margins of the dating market.
You mentioned that a few countries, like Switzerland and Germany, seem to be lagging a bit behind this trend. They still have some remnants of male educational advantage. Why are they the outliers? Is it just, cultural conservatism?
It's less about a general sense of culture and more about specific institutional design, particularly the structure of their educational and vocational systems.
Okay.
These countries have really robust dual education systems, strong vocational training traditions. So a man in Germany with a master electrician certificate, for example, or a complex engineering trade certification, he often has higher earning power and more instrumental value than a guy with a general liberal arts degree.
So his economic value isn't tied just to a university degree, it's diversified.
Precisely. Those systems maintain a parallel path to high instrumental value for men, which acts as a kind of buffer against that rapid H-index decline you see elsewhere. But even in those outlier countries, the trend is still moving towards female advantage. It's just slower.
So the global hypothesis holds.
It does. The growth in female educational advantage directly correlates with the decline of hypergamy. It's a global transformation.
Okay, the numbers are undeniable. But how does an H-index reversal translate into that feeling of being sociologically obsolete, like the woman in the opening story said about the architect. If a man's economic utility is deflated, what replaces it in the value calculation, especially for women who are already highly educated and financially secure?
That's the crucial translation, isn't it? When that provisioning value, the E for economic in the equation, when it drops to 0 for a high-status woman, a new filter has to emerge to sort through the massive pool and potential partners. And what replaces that economic utility premium is a new dominant variable, alignment.
Alignment. So ideological, sociopolitical, worldview conformity.
Exactly. It's not just about, sharing values in a fuzzy sense. It's about passing a much stricter ideological purity test that ensures a high degree of, they call it relational conformity.
So for these high-status independent women, the whole calculation of a man's value changes.
It simplifies drastically. We can basically model it. A modern man's value becomes a function of his genetic fitness, his G, and this alignment A. But the weighting on alignment, let's call it zeta, it approaches infinity. If a candidate fails that A filter, his fitness, his income, his stability, none of it matters. He might be genetically fit, but he is socially incompatible.
But hold on, if the data shows homogamy is still the most common pairing, isn't alignment maybe just a secondary preference, not this total replacement you're suggesting?
That's a great question. It's an important nuance. Homogamy is about pairing by educational or status level. But within that high-status pool where everyone is already successful, the key differentiator becomes the A filter. When resources are abundant and equal, scarcity shifts. It's no longer about financial capacity. It becomes about social and emotional compatibility.
Which is now being defined almost entirely by ideological alignment.
You've got it. The architect in your story wasn't rejected for his income. He was rejected because his bios signaled traditional values. And in that woman's high-status world, that's a signal of a fundamental alignment failure.
And the Berkeley study had specific data on this ideological gap.
It did. The study found that women's self-professed adherence to egalitarian and progressive principles was, on average, 3 times higher than that of men. 3 times. This is not a small difference of opinion.
No, that's a chasm.
It's a gender binary fission in worldview. When half the population sees the world through a radically different moral and ideological lens than the other half, the whole idea of a shared social contract, one built on compromise and shared goals, it just collapses. The architect was sociologically obsolete because his values, stability, clear family roles were based on a worldview his potential partner had already declared bankrupt.
And this is where it gets really interesting, because you have this economic deflation of the median man's value. You have this rising ideological gap, and then it's all just catastrophically amplified by the digital world. It creates this profound environmental mismatch.
That acts exactly like John B. Calhoun's behavioral sink.
Right.
Calhoun's work with mice in what he called Universe 25 is. It's maybe the most chillingly relevant piece of behavioral ecology for what we're seeing today. He basically created a mouse paradise. Like perfect habitat, limitless food and water, no predators, perfect climate, everything they needed. He started with just 8 mice.
And the expectation was that they'd flourish and fill the space.
But the exact opposite happened. The population peaked way early at around 600, and then behavioral dysfunction started to set in long before any resources were actually scarce.
But the collapse wasn't from scarcity.
It was from abundance stripped of meaning, purpose, and required social roles. When life demands no effort, no friction, no meaningful contribution, the social fabric just dissolves. Around day 315 of the experiment, despite perfect conditions, the mice started showing these severe pathological behaviors.
What kind of behaviors? What did that breakdown look like?
The fundamental roles of their society just broke down. The males stopped defending territory, they stopped courtship rituals. Females started abandoning their young, sometimes just forgetting about them entirely. The social code that's required to manage density in an environment of total abundance it vanished. Calhoun called this phenomenon death squared.
Death squared.
The behavioral extinction, the death of social vitality and purpose, comes before the biological extinction. The mice died socially long before they died physically.
And when you map that onto the human condition today, the digital age, the parallels are they're striking. Our digital ecosystem is a cognitive version of Universe 25.
Yep. It really is. We have infinite information, infinite entertainment, the illusion of infinite mate access, and yet what we see are epidemic levels of social atomization and psychological distress.
The digital world is a perfect simulation of the behavioral sink.
It removes the need for genuine social effort. We can simulate connection, we can simulate achievement, simulate intimacy, all without taking the real-world risks. And this leads directly to the most famous group from Calhoun's experiment, the beautiful ones.
I remember reading about them. The group that just completely withdrew.
They retreated into compulsive self-grooming, eating, and sleeping. They completely avoided all social and sexual behavior. They were, in Calhoun's own words, aesthetically refined and socially obsolete. They looked perfect, their fur was immaculate, but they were totally inert. They couldn't reproduce, couldn't defend territory. They just existed to consume the abundance.
That is a perfect description of a certain kind of hyper-focused self-optimization you see on social media today. The curated image, the aesthetic perfection, the extreme fitness. It seems to take precedence over any kind of stable, deep relationship.
And this is all amplified by the sheer volume of choice. Think about that story of Sarah in London. She's on the dating app. She has thousands of matches. This digital environment, giving her the illusion of infinite choice, it artificially inflates her screening thresholds to an impossible level. Every tiny flaw is magnified.
It's just overstimulation. You're in a digital crowd, and it leads to apathy. No real human can compete with the curated perfection of thousands of different profiles.
And the brain's defense mechanism against that chaos of endless choice is reproductive inhibition. It defends itself by applying an impossible filter, which basically paralyzes the person into not acting at all. So Sarah hasn't had a second date in years, not because she lacks options, but because she is overwhelmed by her options. She's functionally non-reproductive, just like the beautiful ones.
And the architecture of social media actively encourages this, right?
Yeah.
It rewards performance over substance. You become a performer, not a contributor.
Absolutely. The platforms reward you for crafting this ephemeral, optimized persona that's just designed for engagement and visual consumption. It's completely decoupled from any real accountability or sustained effort. We're rewarded for projecting an identity, not for actually having one.
Let's get into the specific mechanisms that cause this.
Yeah.
This behavioral atrophy. You mentioned the Fisherian runaway effect. That's a fascinating concept from evolution.
It is. The Fisherian runaway effect basically explains how a trait that starts as a genuine signal of fitness can become so heavily favored that it gets exaggerated over generations, sometimes to a point where it's actually bad for survival, all because the preference for the trait and the trait itself are linked. The classic example is the peacock's tail.
Beautiful, but completely impractical for flying away from a predator.
Exactly. And in the digital world, the feedback loops are instantaneous. So this runaway can happen way, way faster than biological evolution. Digital platforms prioritize and amplify surface-level attraction, extreme visual appeal, high fashion, curated travel, performative wealth. These are the new peacock tails.
While the things that actually matter for a long-term relationship, stability, reliability, emotional maturity, are really hard to signal in a photo or a 15-second video.
So the market rewards performance and extremes. It creates this evolutionary drift that's totally decoupled from actual relational success. You get an oversupply of people who look perfect online, but who just lack the depth for sustained, difficult, real-world investment.
On top of that, you've got the increasing reliance on AI, which is automating our cognitive labor. It's removing the necessary friction we need for development.
That idea of friction is so critical. When AI can generate complex ideas or curate your decisions or synthesize arguments for you, it removes the cognitive effort you need to build mental stamina. It's just like Calhoun's mice. They stopped foraging when the food was delivered instantly. We stop reasoning when the answers are delivered instantly.
I get the analogy, but are we really losing the capacity for complex thought? Or are we just, choosing the easier path? It seems a bit fatalistic to say AI is destroying our moral reasoning.
Well, maybe not destroying, but causing it to atrophy. The skills needed for complex questioning, for synthesizing conflicting information, for reasoning through a tough moral dilemma, these are like muscles. They get weaker if you don't use them. When instant answer replaces the whole process of finding the answer, we short-circuit our own development. And the result is the decline of what we call conceptual space.
Conceptual space. So the ability to imagine different futures or plan for long-term intimacy.
Or even just engage in a complex moral debate. Exactly. Intimacy and long-term relationships are inherently difficult. They require imagining compromise, co-creating a future that doesn't exist yet, and enduring the friction of two different people. If all the cognitive friction is removed from your daily life and you're only consuming algorithmic curated output, you lose the mental muscle for that complex relational investment.
So that brings us to the third pillar. If the external world is rigged, economically dismantling male value and digitally creating impossible standards. What is the rational response for the person facing this, especially a man facing market marginalization?
You see a shift from external negotiation to internal fortification, a strategic retreat. For the median man who realizes his financial value is deflated and the dating market is just this algorithmically skewed validation trap, the adaptive strategy is what we'd call strategic reorientation. They recognize the cost of entry, both financially and emotionally, is now way higher than the potential reward. They withdraw irrationally. They see the whole social structure as a trap that demands too much for too little psychological benefit.
And we see this perfectly in the story of Marcus from the Midwest.
Marcus is the archetype. After years of trying to fit into a sexual economy that gave him diminishing returns, he just chose stoic indifference. His decision wasn't bitter. It wasn't about failure. It was cold, calculated risk management. He recognized the profound incentive incompatibility.
But what did he do?
He deleted his apps, stopped chasing validation, and focused entirely on his internal goal architecture. His realization was simple. The contract is asymmetric. The demands on him were completely disproportionate to the stability or security being offered in return.
So he wasn't angry. He was just doing a cost-benefit analysis on his own time and energy and found it was a bad deal.
Which leads directly to this philosophy of monk mode. It's a rational survival strategy. It's based on radical self-mastery and the strict denial of what are called junk activities. It's about rechanneling your finite energy away from consumption and towards compounding production.
Okay, let's break that down. What exactly are these junk activities that someone in monk mode has to give up?
They're defined as anything that gives you immediate, low-utility gratification but provides zero compounding returns on your long-term capital, whether that's physical, financial, or intellectual.
So like what?
It falls into a few broad categories. First, passive consumption. Binge-watching TV shows, endlessly scrolling social media, obsessively reading forums like Reddit. Second, chemical escapism. Using alcohol or drugs in a way that makes you unproductive the next day, essentially stealing your own future potential.
And the third?
Frictionless pleasure. This is a big one. It's things like consuming pornography or compulsive video game playing. Activities that simulate high-risk, high-reward experiences like sex or achievement, but without requiring any of the real-world effort or contribution.
So it's basically a conscious rejection of the behavioral sinks utopia. You're actively reintroducing friction and effort into a life that's been designed for comfortable redundancy.
Exactly. And the time you save is meticulously redirected. It goes towards skill acquisition, building physical capital through intense fitness, and achieving financial independence. The psychological core of it all is the pursuit of what's called psychological sovereignty.
What does that mean exactly?
It's about achieving congruence with the truth, being brutally honest with yourself about your weaknesses and strengths. Once you do that, you gain this self-mastery. Your vulnerabilities can't be used as weapons against you anymore because you've already faced them, and that eliminates the need for external validation.
This sounds incredibly powerful. I mean, as an adaptive strategy for an individual who feels marginalized, it makes perfect sense. But what are the sociological implications if this scales up, if millions of people do this?
That is the critical paradox. For the individual, it's a highly successful defensive adaptation. They optimize their own utility and self-worth in a market that's giving them nothing. But for society, if large cohorts of individuals, men and women, stop making relational, civic, and reproductive investments, it just deepens the macro-level behavioral sink that Calhoun observed.
So if the best strategy for marginalized men is to withdraw, then society loses their civic and relational contribution.
We do. And as that withdrawal accelerates, the structural bonds of society get weaker. Things like courtship, community engagement, family formation. Society requires a certain amount of cooperative, high-risk relational investment to keep going. If a huge segment of the population chooses monk mode or its female equivalent, which might be hyper-focused on career and self-care, then the burden of holding everything together falls on a shrinking and increasingly stressed group of people.
And this collapse of bonding in family structures must be showing up in clinical settings, right? In therapy offices.
Oh, absolutely. Mental health professionals are reporting widespread existential drift and severe relationship fatigue. People aren't just suffering from personal neuroses anymore, they're suffering from a lack of ecological scaffolding. Their roles are undefined, their incentives are all out of whack, and this means we need a fundamental shift in how we practice mental health.
We have to move beyond just treating individual disorders.
We have to start thinking about rebuilding the ecological scaffolding for human connection. The therapist's job shifts from fixing the person to helping the person co-create generative roles in a world where the traditional blueprints are gone. We have to help clients, both men and women, navigate this new fluid world of expectations around partnership and identity.
So the therapy room becomes a sort of microculture, a safe place where the friction of genuine relational behavior can be practiced before being applied to the real world.
Exactly. The core challenge is connecting modern autonomy, which we all celebrate, with our ancient hardwired needs for belonging and purpose. If we fail to encourage active investment in community and connection, the behavioral sink will just become irreversible. Withdrawal, while it's rational for the individual, is catastrophic for the system. So when we pull these three pillars together, the economic dismantling of the old contract, the digital acceleration of the behavioral sink, and these rational withdrawal strategies, the conclusion is pretty clear. We're in an era of profound hyper-individualization. The gender schism isn't a small disagreement. It's the psychological symptom of a total collapse of shared incentives. The old social contract is gone. It's been replaced by a hyper-rational, ideological filtering on one side and rational, survival-based withdrawal on the other.
And the final critical thought for you to consider is this. The new terms of extinction are behavioral, not biological. We risk becoming the ultimate evolution of Calhoun's mice. Perfectly fed, perfectly safe, aesthetically refined, optimized in our own little bubbles, yet behaviorally inert and socially disconnected. Cultural extinction doesn't happen with bombs or famine. It happens through apathy and abstraction, through the quiet, rational choice to withdraw from the necessary friction of genuine connection. The ultimate challenge for us is learning to rediscover action, contribution, and relational friction in a world that offers total, comfortable redundancy. We have to consciously design environments and incentives that challenge the seductive idea that individual autonomy is always better than interdependence. We have to find necessity in a world that offers us none.